Harlem in the 1950s was a world built on two things: style and ironclad rules. The neon lights of the Apollo and the Savoy Ballroom flickered over streets where a man's word was his life insurance policy. At the center of this world sat Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson. He was a poet, a chess player, and a man who could order a hit as calmly as he ordered a glass of scotch. But every king has a queen, and for Bumpy that was Mayme Johnson. She was the grace to his grit, the elegance to his edge. To the people of Harlem, Mayme was untouchable. She wasn't just the wife of the most powerful man in the neighborhood. She was a symbol of the heights a black woman could reach in a world designed to keep her down. Bumpy protected her with a ferocity that bordered on the religious. He didn't just keep her safe, he kept her world pristine. While Bumpy walked through the mud of the numbers racket and the blood of territory wars, Mayme walked on silk. But there is a specific type of man, a man blinded by his own ambition and intoxicated by his own reflection, who looks at a queen and sees an opportunity. They look at the king's absence as a vacuum rather than a trap. This is the story of Julian "Silk" Henderson, a man who thought he could play a game with the Godfather's heart and walk away with the prize. Julian Henderson earned his nickname because he never wore a suit that cost less than $200, and his voice sounded like it had been dipped in honey and aged in a barrel of bourbon. He was a high-level associate, a man who handled the cleaner aspects of Bumpy's empire: real estate, front businesses, and the occasional negotiation with downtown interests. He was smart, he was capable, and most importantly, he was trusted. Bumpy saw a bit of his younger self in Julian, the sharp mind, the tactical thinking. But Bumpy had something Julian lacked: a moral compass that, while crooked, always pointed toward loyalty. The cheat didn't start in a dark alley or with a gun. It started with a smile and a series of accidental encounters. Julian began showing up where Mayme was. At the charity galas, at the high-end dress shops on Fifth Avenue, at the quiet afternoon teas at the Hotel Teresa. He was charming, he was attentive, and he began to weave a web of subtle manipulation. He didn't just want Mayme, he wanted the status that came with her. He thought that if he could win her over, spiritually, emotionally, or physically, he would be the successor to the throne. He was trying to cheat the natural order of the Harlem hierarchy by taking the one thing Bumpy valued more than his life. But Julian made a mistake that many men of his caliber make. He underestimated the woman. Mayme Johnson wasn't a prize to be won, she was a partner in an empire. She saw the silk for exactly what it was: a thin fabric covering a hollow man. She let him talk. She let him buy the expensive lunches. She let him believe his charm was working. Not because she was tempted, but because she knew that in Harlem, you don't just kill a snake the moment you see it. You wait until it leads you back to the nest. She wanted to know if Julian was acting alone or if he was the face of a larger betrayal. On a humid Thursday in July 1956, the game reached its tipping point. Julian, emboldened by Bumpy's week-long trip to Chicago to settle a dispute with the outfit, decided to make his move. He invited Mayme to a private dinner at a secure location, a penthouse he kept under a false name. He told her it was about protecting the business, while Bumpy was away. He claimed he had evidence of a coup and that she was the only one he could trust. It was a classic play. Create a crisis, offer yourself as the savior, and reap the rewards of the resulting vulnerability. Mayme arrived, dressed in a midnight blue gown that made her look like a goddess carved out of the night sky. Julian had the champagne on ice, the soft jazz playing on the phonograph, and a speech prepared that would have made a romantic novelist blush. He spoke of Bumpy's declining grip, the changing times, and how a woman like Mayme deserved a man who was future-facing rather than stuck in the trenches of the past. He reached out, his hand sliding across the table toward hers, his eyes filled with a calculated heat. "Mayme," he whispered, his voice the very definition of silk. "Bumpy is a legend, but legends belong in books. We belong in the sun. With me you aren't just the wife of a gangster. You're the partner of a titan." Mayme didn't pull her hand away. She looked at his fingers, well-manicured, soft, the hands of a man who had never had to fight for what he owned. Then she looked him directly in the eyes. There was no fear in her gaze. There was no hesitation. There was only a cold, terrifying pity. "Julian," she said, her voice like a velvet hammer, "you've spent so much time looking at the crown that you forgot to look at the man wearing it? You think Ellsworth is in Chicago? He's been in the next room for 20 minutes. And he's very interested in your vision of the future." The color didn't just drain from Julian's face, it evaporated. The soft jazz seemed to turn into a funeral dirge. The door behind him creaked open, and the shadow that fell across the table was long, heavy, and carried the scent of expensive tobacco and impending doom. Bumpy Johnson hadn't gone to Chicago. He had gone to the shadows, waiting to see exactly how far the silk would stretch before it snapped. The silence that followed Mayme's revelation was more than just an absence of sound. It was a physical pressure, the kind that precedes a massive lightning strike. Julian, silk, Henderson sat frozen, his hands still resting on the table, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of the moment. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. The air in the room had shifted from the sweet scent of expensive champagne to the metallic, biting chill of a meat locker. Bumpy Johnson didn't rush in. He didn't shout. He walked with the slow, rhythmic gait of a man who owned every atom of the space he occupied. He pulled out the chair directly opposite Julian, moving with a deliberate grace that made the wood scrape against the floor like a scream. Bumpy sat down, leaning back into the plush upholstery, his face partially obscured by the amber glow of the penthouse lamps. He looked at the champagne, then at Julian's trembling hand and finally at his wife. "Mayme, darling," Bumpy said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "You look exquisite. But I think Mr. Henderson's hospitality has reached its limit. Why don't you head down to the car? Curtis is waiting. I think Julian and I have some future-facing business to discuss." Mayme stood up, her silk gown whispering against the floorboards. She didn't look at Julian. To her, he was already a ghost, a memory of a mistake that Harlem would soon forget. She kissed Bumpy's cheek, a soft gesture that felt like a death warrant to the man sitting at the table, and walked out. The click of the door behind her sounded like the falling of a guillotine blade. Bumpy reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silver cigar case. He took his time selecting one, clipping the end with a gold-plated cutter and lighting it. He blew a long, thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling, watching it swirl in the light. "You know, Julian," Bumpy began, his tone almost conversational, "I've spent a lot of time in chess clubs. I've watched men sacrifice queens to win a game. But those were wooden pieces. In the real world, when you try to take a man's queen, you aren't playing a game. You're declaring a war where only one side has soldiers." Julian finally found his voice, though it was a thin, ragged version of the silk he usually peddled. "Bumpy. Ellsworth, it's not what it looks like. I was testing her. I heard rumors downtown. The Genovese family, they're looking for a crack. I wanted to see if she was vulnerable. I did it for you." Bumpy laughed. It wasn't a hearty sound, it was a dry, raspy sound that never reached his eyes. "Testing her? Julian, you've been testing the company's real estate holdings too. I know about the 3 brownstones on 145th you've been skimming from. I know about the kickbacks from the liquor distributors. I let it go because you were useful. Because a little greed is natural in a man with talent. But this." Bumpy leaned forward, the light hitting the deep scars on his face, reminders of the wars with Dutch Schultz and the long nights in Alcatraz. "This isn't greed. This is an ego that's grown too large for its skull." Bumpy stood up and began to pace the perimeter of the room. He stopped at the window, looking out over the flickering lights of Harlem. To Julian it looked like a king surveying his domain. To Bumpy it was a reminder of what happened when you let a single weed grow in a garden. "You told her I was stuck in the trenches," Bumpy said, his back still turned. "You told her I was a legend belonging in a book. You're right about one thing, Julian. I am a legend. And do you know why? Because I understand the weight of things. I understand that a man's empire is only as strong as the loyalty of the people who build it. If I let you walk out of here after you tried to cheat me out of my wife and my dignity, then I'm not a king. I'm just a man with a fancy suit and a temporary lease on life." Bumpy turned back around. His expression hadn't changed, but his eyes were now fixed on Julian with a predatory intensity. "People think brutal means blood, Julian. They think it means broken bones and loud noises. But the most brutal thing you can do to a man like you, a man who loves his silk, who loves his status, is to take away his identity. To strip him of everything that makes him feel like he's better than the man sweeping the gutter." Bumpy snapped his fingers. From the shadows of the hallway, Juno Brown and 2 other enforcers stepped into the light. They weren't carrying guns. They were carrying a heavy canvas bag and a set of industrial shears. Julian's eyes went wide. He tried to stand, but Juno's heavy hand landed on his shoulder, pinning him to the chair with the strength of a hydraulic press. "The suit first, I think," Bumpy said, dabbing the ash from his cigar. "That $200 silk you're so proud of. It's a symbol of a life you no longer possess. Take it off him. Every stitch. I want him to feel the air on his skin and realize how small he actually is." As Julian began to scream and plead, the silk was literally shredded from his body. The expensive fabric was reduced to rags in minutes, discarded on the floor like the debris of a failed dream. But Bumpy wasn't done. The cheat required a more permanent reminder. "Julian," Bumpy whispered, leaning down so his face was inches from the trembling man's ear. "You wanted to be a titan. You wanted to be the man the world looked at. Well, I'm going to make sure that for the rest of your life, whenever someone looks at you, they see exactly what happens when you try to play the Godfather for a fool." The penthouse, which minutes ago had been a sanctuary of luxury, had transformed into a cold, clinical chamber of judgment. As Julian sat shivering, stripped of his expensive namesake, silk, the reality of his situation began to settle in like a heavy fog. He wasn't just losing his clothes, he was losing his skin. Bumpy Johnson stood over him, the smoke from his cigar curling around his head like a halo of shadow. "You see, Julian," Bumpy said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that cut through the sound of Julian's chattering teeth. "In Harlem there are men who work, men who lead, and men who scavenge. I thought you were a leader. But you're a scavenger, picking at the edges of a life you didn't build. And scavengers don't get to keep their trophies." Bumpy nodded toward the door. Juno and the enforcers didn't need a verbal command. They hoisted Julian up, his bare feet dragging against the polished hardwood. They didn't take him to the elevator. They took him through the service door, down the back stairs where the trash was collected. It was a symbolic descent, from the heights of the penthouse to the bowels of the city. They ended up in a basement laundry room, a place of damp concrete and the rhythmic industrial hum of boilers. The heat was stifling, a stark contrast to the air-conditioned luxury Julian had just been evicted from. Bumpy followed them down, never losing his composure, never raising his voice. He watched as they threw Julian into a wooden chair in the center of the room. "You like to talk, Julian," Bumpy said, pulling a small velvet-lined box from his pocket. "You told my wife you were the future. You told her you were a titan. That tongue of yours, it's been your greatest asset. It's also your greatest liability." Julian's eyes fixed on the box. He expected a gun. He expected a knife. But when Bumpy opened it, the light hit something far more terrifying. A set of branding irons, small and intricate, crafted with the precision of a jeweler. "The Italians downtown, they have their ways," Bumpy continued, pacing the small, humid room. "They like to use concrete shoes or lead in the back of the head. Quickly. But I've always found that a dead man doesn't learn anything. A dead man can't tell the world why he's dead. I want you to be a living book, Julian. I want everyone who looks at you to read the story of your ambition." He handed one of the irons to Juno. It bore a small, stylized symbol, not a mark of a gang but a mark of a cheat. It was a design Bumpy had seen in an old history book, a mark used for those who betrayed their masters in ancient times. "No blood tonight, Juno," Bumpy instructed. "Just heat. And memory." The process was slow. It was methodical. Bumpy didn't watch with glee. He watched with the detached interest of a scientist. He didn't want to hear Julian scream, though the sound echoed off the concrete walls until it became a part of the basement's atmosphere. He wanted Julian to understand the weight of the brutal outcome. Every time Julian tried to beg for his life, Bumpy would remind him of the dinner. He would remind him of the hand sliding across the table toward Mayme. He would remind him of the words he used to describe the declining grip of the man who had given him everything. "You think I'm old, Julian? You think I'm a legend in a book?" Bumpy asked as the smell of scorched skin filled the room. "The thing about legends is that they endure. They outlast the fashion. They outlast the silk. They certainly outlast the men who try to replace them before their time." By 3 a.m. Julian was a shell. He wasn't just physically broken. His spirit had been systematically dismantled. He had been marked on his chest, right over his heart, and on the palm of his right hand, the hand he had reached out to Mayme. The marks were permanent, a scarlet letter, for the Harlem underworld. Bumpy leaned over him one last time. "I'm not going to kill you, Julian. That would be too easy for both of us. Instead, I'm giving you exactly what you wanted. You wanted to be seen? Now you will be. But you're leaving Harlem. Tonight. If I ever hear your name mentioned in this borough again, if I ever see a man in a silk suit who looks even remotely like you, I'll finish what we started here. You're going to spend the rest of your life in the shadows, explaining those marks to anyone foolish enough to ask." Bumpy turned and walked toward the stairs. He stopped at the threshold, looking back at the broken man in the chair. "And Julian? The $200 you spent on that dinner? Consider it your last payment to the Johnson estate. I'm keeping the penthouse. I think I'll turn it into a library. For people who actually want to read books rather than be in them." As Bumpy climbed the stairs back toward the light, he felt the weight of the night settling on his shoulders. It wasn't the weight of guilt, it was the weight of maintenance. A king doesn't just sit on a throne, he keeps the throne clean. And in Harlem, the only way to keep it clean was to ensure that the outcome for those who tried to cheat was so brutal that nobody would ever dare to try again. The sun began to bleed over the Harlem River, casting long orange fingers across the rooftops of 125th Street. It was a new day, but for the underworld of Upper Manhattan, the atmosphere had shifted overnight. Information in Harlem moved faster than the A train, and by the time the first shopkeepers were rolling up their metal grates, the story of Julian's silk Henderson had already become a cautionary tale whispered over coffee and newspapers. Bumpy Johnson didn't go home immediately. He sat in the back of his Cadillac, parked on a quiet corner overlooking Morningside Park. He watched the city wake up, the honest laborers heading to the subways, the mothers walking their children to school. This was the Harlem he claimed to protect, the community he considered his parish. But he knew that to keep this peace, he had to remain the monster in the basement when necessary. Juno Brown climbed into the front seat, his breathing heavy, his hands still smelling of the industrial basement and copper. "He's gone, Bumpy," Juno said, staring straight ahead. "We put him on a bus to Savannah. No luggage, no money, just the clothes on his back and those marks. He won't be coming back. I don't think he could even if he wanted to. He's a broken clock." Bumpy nodded slowly. "It wasn't just about Julian, Juno. You know that. The Italians have been watching. They've been sending silk types into our territory for months, trying to see if we've gone soft. They think because I buy my suits at the same shops they do, and because I quote Spinoza, that I've forgotten the feel of the concrete." "They know now," Juno grunted. The message was received. Indeed, the message wasn't just for the street level. Later that afternoon, Bumpy arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet Italian bakery on the edge of East Harlem, the border between his territory and the Genovese family's turf. He sat across from Fat Tony Salerno, a man who understood the language of power as well as Bumpy did. Bumpy didn't mention Julian by name. He didn't complain about the cheat. He simply placed a small piece of shredded silk fabric on the table between them. "Tony," Bumpy said, his voice as smooth as the cannoli on the plate, "I've spent a lot of time cleaning up my garden lately. It seems some of the seeds from your side of the fence have been blowing over into my yard. I've dealt with the weeds, but I thought I'd return this to you. It's a fine material, but it doesn't hold up well under heat." Salerno looked at the scrap of fabric, then back at Bumpy. He saw the Alcatraz stare, the look of a man who had nothing left to fear and everything left to lose. "I hear you, Ellsworth," Tony replied, his voice raspy. "Sometimes the young ones get ahead of themselves. They think they can skip the line. It won't happen again." The truce was silent, but it was absolute. By striking Julian in the most brutal way possible, not by taking his life, but by destroying his persona, Bumpy had demonstrated a level of psychological control that terrified his rivals. A dead man is a martyr. A marked and broken man is a walking advertisement for your enemy's ruthlessness. When Bumpy finally returned to the brownstone on 127th Street, the house was quiet. He found Mayme in the parlor, reading a book of poetry by Langston Hughes. She looked up as he entered, her eyes searching his face for any sign of the man who had been in that basement. She found only her husband. "Is it finished?" she asked softly. "It's finished," Bumpy replied. He sat down beside her, the weight of the crown finally feeling a little lighter. "Harlem is a beautiful place, Mayme. But it's a place that demands a high price for its beauty. Julian didn't want to pay the tax." Mayme reached out and took his hand. "He thought he could use me to get to you. He didn't realize that I am the only reason you stay human, Ellsworth." Bumpy looked at his wife, the woman who had stood by him through prison terms, gang wars, and the constant threat of the electric chair. He realized then that the cheat wasn't just about power or money. It was an attack on the only thing in his life that wasn't for sale. The story of Bumpy Johnson and the man who tried to cheat with his wife became a legend in Harlem, passed down through generations of barbershops and jazz clubs. It served as a reminder that while Bumpy was a man of culture and intellect, he was also the ultimate arbiter of respect. You could disagree with his business, you could fight him for territory, but if you touched his family, the outcome would be more than just brutal, it would be eternal. Julian Silk Henderson was never seen in New York again. Some say he died a lonely man in the South. Others say he spent his days in a mental ward, constantly trying to rub the marks off his skin. But in Harlem, the name Silk became a synonym for a specific kind of foolishness. the kind that believes a fancy suit can protect you from the consequences of a hollow heart. Bumpy Johnson continued to rule Harlem until his death in 1968. He died as he lived, on his own terms in a restaurant surrounded by the people who respected him. And through it all, Mayme remained at his side, the Queen of Harlem, protected by a love that was as brutal as it was beautiful. The world of Bumpy Johnson was one of sharp contrasts: luxury and violence, poetry and power, loyalty and betrayal. The story of Julian Henderson is a testament to the fact that in the streets of Harlem, the most dangerous thing you can do is mistake kindness for weakness. Bumpy spared Julian's life, but he took his soul, proving that sometimes, living with the memory of your failure is a far worse punishment than death. If this deep dive into the dark history of Harlem hit different, you already know what to do. Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the legends who built the concrete jungle. Next week we're going even deeper into the archives. We're looking at the time Bumpy Johnson went toe-to-toe with the legendary Five Families in a sit-down that changed the face of organized crime forever. You're not going to want to miss the Treaty of 116th Street. Drop a comment below. Do you think Bumpy was right to let Julian live with the marks, or should he have finished him in that basement? Was the brutal outcome enough of a message, or did it leave a door open for future betrayals? I read every single comment and I want to hear your take on the Godfather's justice. Remember, in the Kingdom of Harlem, everyone wants the crown but nobody wants to pay the price. Stay sharp, stay loyal, and we'll see you in the next one.